First of all, I want to say thank you to Julian for having me here and the great conference. Yeah, I'm really enjoying this. So I want to say that my abstract and my paper changed a bit from the moment I wrote it. So yeah, as Julian said, my core, like my research, the core of my thesis is the official apologies. However, I'm really interested in identity creation, and I think it's a very important part before we reach to the concept of apology to actually explore identity. So here in this paper, I'm focusing more on the identity creation in the book of Emir Sulajić, Postcards from the Grave. I decided to drop the trauma theory of which I was about to use, but then I decided I'm going to focus on something very specific, which is the decision of the author to publish with a specific publishing house, which is not in Bosnia, which is not in Serbia, right? It's far away, I'm going to tell you now. And then I'm going to be using as well the theory of Manuel Castells about identity creation. Okay, so I'm going to start. Bosnian Emir Sulajić published his first book, Postcards from the Grave, in July 2005, and 10 years after the massacre in Srebrenica. The work spans over a period of several years, from the beginning until the end of the Bosnian War. He wrote it as a testimony of what happened before and after the Srebrenica massacre. He was 17 years old at the time of the massacre, right? And the phrase I will never forget from his book is, "I survived because that day Mladić felt like God." Okay, so this is the phrase which like really struck me. So he was working as an interpreter for the United Nations, and he had the chance to escape, right? Well, not to escape, but to be safe from the United Nations, as he was acting as an interpreter, right? And then the book was first published in 2005 by the independent UK publisher Saki Books, and it is the first book published in English by a Bosnian who lived through the war. Now here, I was thinking just before we started, when you gave this summary from yesterday, the silence we were discussing yesterday, like this is in 2005. It's the first book who was published in English by a Bosnian, right? This is like 10 years after the massacre. So yeah, it's just 10 years of like complete silence. The book, however, was not an immediate response to the war. There were various books which were published during and right after the war, but most of them were from English-speaking journalists or historians who were covering the tragic events at that time. I'll just give you two examples. Probably you know the Noel Malcolm's Bosnia, A Short History, which was published in 1994, just right before the war ended, and also Misha Glenny's. It's a really acclaimed book by and it's called The Fall of Yugoslavia, which was published in 1992 by Penguin. Now, this paper aims to explore the choice of the author to publish his first book with Saki and the publishing house interest in the book, given the geographical distance and the topic, right? I'm particularly interested in the fact that the author is using an ideologically community and religious related publisher as a springboard in order to not only gain support, but also have the text as unedited as possible, right? And something else I want to mention, hopefully I'll be meeting Emir Sulajić this week while I'm here, so I'm going to find out more about his choice to publish with Saki. Now, what is more, this paper will engage into analysis of the connection between community and identity construction by showing the relevance of physical boundaries in present days, and that identity construction is not only on the part of the author, but also on the publishing house. And in order to do so, I will be using Manuel Castells' theory on identity. Now, Emir Sulajić, just a bit of a background on him, read political science at the University of Sarajevo after year 2000, and between 2002 and 2004, he reported on Yugoslavian war crime trials from The Hague as a correspondent for the Bosnian weekly Dani newspaper. Those of you who are from here probably remember this newspaper. Now, that was the period when he was almost ready to publish his first book as a testimony. Now, the publishing house, Al-Saki, which means the one who gives you water, that's the literal translation, was founded in London in 1978, and its main interest is in publishing books on North Africa and the Middle East, right? Actually, it is one of the principal publishing houses for Arab-speaking cultures, and it supplies universities and libraries, as well as other institutions with material on the Arabic world, both in Arabic and English language. Its name is well known and respected in the world of publishing, and books of authors that were banned in their own countries, as for example, Queens of the Screen, Pioneers of Egyptian Cinema, was actually, that was the springboard for them to be published, right? Because in their own countries they were forbidden. Now this book, Queens of the Screen, is the history of 4 women who started the Egyptian cinema industry, and it was banned from publishing in Egypt because one of the women appears in a nightgown, right? And then Banat al-Riyad is another book who's also banned in Saudi Arabia. And it was censored because the girls were talking about their daily lives, about the relationship between men and women, okay, in that time. On the one hand, the writer, Spahić, was seeking to have his text as unedited as possible. Submitting a text that deals with Muslim references might mean having many chances of getting a response from a mainstream publisher, asking for footnotes and glossaries that might make the text more palatable to a readership, not knowledgeable of concepts, terms or references. In this book, however, in his book, the references to terms and concepts which are strictly Muslim or Bosnian are very few, okay? And then he gives explanation to them. For example, the author gives a map of all the places he makes reference to in his book, right? So there are a few maps at the beginning of the book where he explains where everything happens. So if the reader is lost, so you can go back to the beginning of the book and actually explore where this happened. Now, the words he uses are perfectly palatable for an English speaker, and it makes no reference to any specific Bosnian or Muslim term or concept except two in the whole book. But he tackles a subject which was and still is creating conflict, which is the genocide in Bosnia, right? And then it was very difficult for an entirely Bosnian point of view to be published by a Serbian publishing house at that time, right? And this is why one of the reasons Spahić chooses probably to publish with Saki Books. And this might be the fact that ideologically Postcards from the Grave fitted their main publishing interest, which is like books which are banned in their countries. I mean, in the case of Postcards from the Grave, it was not banned, but it was difficult to publish, right? Now, my particular interest rises from the fact that ideologically and religiously, the author seeks to publish with a publisher who will serve as a springboard to then be able to have more chances in the future to be published by mainstream publishers such as Penguin or Macmillan, for example, right? Once you publish with somebody, then it's easier for you to publish with somebody else. Then on the other hand, it might be very revealing for the thesis in the paper to interview the writer, which I'm doing, as I already told you. Sorry, I'm like really... okay, so here I was thinking that I would like to make a parallel between Al-Saki Publishing House and Arte Publico Press. I don't know if you heard of Arte Publico Press. And the authors they choose to publish. Some of the first Chicano writers, as Sandra Cisnero, for example, with her The House on Mango Street, or filmmaker Luis Valdez, all started with Arte Publico Press in Texas. Because that publishing house was extremely tolerant with the use of words in Spanish or Spanglish, okay, and with references that were often inside jokes among Chicanos, but would alienate or even antagonize an Anglo readership, right? So there was probably also some self-publishing going on at that time, which reinforced the need Chicano writers to have a publishing house such as Arte Publico Press. Now, Nicolás Canellos, which is the director of the Arte Publico Press and a professor of Hispanic literature at the University of Houston, says, in the early 70s, it became obvious that the Hispanic writers were not being published by mainstream presses because there was no outlet for the creative efforts of these Latino writers. Their work was condemned to be forgotten, lost, or just delivered orally through performance. To address this need, then Canellos decided to form Arte Publico Press. Okay. Now, going back to the central idea, identities, as Hall argues, can be thought. Sorry, I'll just pause. So yeah, identity, as Hall argues, can be thought of in two different ways. right? The first one is the stable. It is formed, it is from shared culture with people who we have some historical experience and shared culture codes. The second view, however, is not what we are, but what we have become. And Stuart Hall writes in his article about cultural identities that cultural identity is a matter of becoming as well as of being. It belongs to the future as much as to the past. Now, I would like to pay closer attention to Manuel Castells and his theory of identity. In his book, The Power of Identity, The Information Age, Economy, Society, and Culture, he talks about three main types of identities: legitimizing, resistance, and project identity. The first one, legitimizing identity, Castells defines as the one introduced by the dominant institutions of society to extend and rationalize their dominant vis-a-vis social actors, but also fits various theories of nationalism. Okay, that's the first type of identity, which is the legitimizing identity. The second type, resistant identities, are generated by those actors who are in position or condition, devalued and or stigmatized by the logic of domination, thus building trenches of resistance and survival on the basis of principles different from or opposed to those permitting the institutions of society. Okay? And the third type, Castells referred to as project identities. It is when social actors, on the basis of whatever cultural materials are available to them, build a new identity that redefines their position in society, and by doing so, seek the transformation of overall social structure. Now, the third one is not a mixture of the previous two concepts, but rather the development of the resistant identity, right? So Emir Sulajic, as well as Saki Books, has a resistance identity. Yeah? As Castells puts it, each type of identity building process leads to a different outcome in constructing society. Now, according to Castells, resistant identities are probably the most important type in our society. They build communities based on collectively resisting against unbearable oppression, and there is a sense of alienation also. By not being able to publish his book in his country, Sulajic is resisting the oppression of not being able to share his story. Nevertheless, his careful planning to open up to as wider a readership as possible in order to help his future career might be taken as a project identity at the same time. Now, his resistant identity has become an opportunity to develop in him the project of becoming heard from as many people as possible. Now, in this case also, if we're going back to Chicano literature, is also part of the resistant identity because their texts were full of references not palatable to the Anglo readership. And now to conclude, the comparison between Emir Sulajic postcards from the grave and Chicano literature arises from the fact that their texts were different and not very publishable at the beginning when they were created, right? Arte Publico Press gave the authors the opportunity to express themselves freely at the time, and Saki Books did the same for Sulajic. However, geographically speaking, it was different. Now, he had to look outside his community and country in order to find opportunities to publish. Now, another parallel between the two was the content of their text. It clearly antagonized the mainstream readers. In Postcards from the Grave, the main subject was the genocide towards Bosnian people, a taboo subject even until nowadays. Now, Postcards from the Grave have resistance identity according to Manuel Castells' theory because it challenges mainstream established readership expectations. And then the second one is because they found an alternative way to publish their difficult texts outside the mainstream publishing culture. However, going back to his theory of identity, although these two cases started as a resistance identity, this very same identity could easily become project identity, depending on what they respond to and where they're heading, and the final, or not final, goal they want to achieve. Thank you.